describe to me what a black swan event is?
Well, the author Nassim Taleb defines it this way. It's a rare event, it can have a massive impact, and it's unpredictable, at least in retrospect.
Can you tell me examples in the public sector where you might see such an event?
Example would be BSE, or mad cow disease. That would be one where the regulators had to figure out how to deal with that event, which was something that was different than anything that had been recorded prior to that. Massive impacts for the regulated industries and for the public who consume beef. So, and again, had been unpredicted up to that point in time.
One of the lessons I get from your work in this area is that organizations find it very difficult to plan for a black swan incident. And yet, in a sense, to me, it's quite intuitive. How can I plan for something that's unknowable? So
Right.
what can organizations and managers do?
Well, those kind of extreme events, black swan events, they tend to fall into certain categories. So, for example, natural disasters. And, you know, there may be many types of natural disasters, but the impacts on our organizations are actually kind of similar. So if we plan for one and prepare for one, we'll probably be prepared for other ones that have similar kinds of impacts. So for example, many organizations got ready for Y2K, and they were worried about what will happen in the year 2000 when our computers can't handle the data anymore. It turned out to be a non-event, but in preparing for that, these organizations put in place all kinds of disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans, crisis management plans, and that feet quicker. So they weren't ready for that. They hadn't predicted that 9/11 event. They weren't ready for that particular, got them ready when 9/11 happened. For those companies that were affected by that, they were able to, those ones that had good plans in place got back on their killer event, or they didn't prepare for that with that in mind. But the preparations they did for the crisis, for their potential information crisis, enabled them to manage through that event.
So typically, when organizations are developing their risk profile, they will sort of bring together all the talent, and they sit around the table and they decide between them what they need to think about. But it would strike me this wouldn't work for a black swan event, would it?
No.
Because it wouldn't predict that.
And what if something like that hit you? How would you deal with that? No, wouldn't necessarily predict that. So there's two ways you can try to come up with some black swans. One is to think about those things that may have hit you in the past and not forget them. Or actually, three ways. A second way is to look at black swans that have hit other organizations. And the third thing to do is look at those factors in your environment that if there were wild changes in those factors, what would it mean for you? So for example, much of our infrastructure in this country is built to certain standards that assume we'll have certain climatic conditions. Well, with climate change, we may have to think about how will that affect the infrastructure that the organization has? So, just recently we had the Manitoba floods, and so think about would we not allow people to build in low-lying areas, or do we make sure that if we give them compensation that when they build a new home that it's elevated to where it's not going to be harmed? And do we think about what are the levels, how high does it have to be? And if, up until now we've seen floods that raise the water level by 300 feet, do we build to that, or do we build to something much higher because we think under climate change those levels in future could be much more than what we've seen in the past?
In this globalized, interconnected world, does the notion of the notion of testing for a black swan event take on more importance than perhaps 50 years ago when things were more controllable?
Yes, absolutely. And a good example of that is SARS taught us about pandemics, that at one point we could keep those things out of our borders, but with global travel and travel by air, very difficult to, to keep that kind of thing out.
Mhm.
So we have to think about it differently, and we have to think about the way we manage that and protect ourselves against that differently.